Good morning. Welcome to our discussion of personal responsibility in criminal law. My name is Lois Herrington, and I'll introduce the panelists in a few minutes. Last year in America, we had over 34 million victims of crime. Approximately 5 million of those were victims of violent crime. Recent statistics have shown in the United States that for every 100 violent crimes committed, 55 are reported to the police. 18 are apprehended, 11 are filed for prosecution, 9 are convicted, 6 are indicted, 4 go to jail, and 2 go to prison. In recent years, for the first time, we have focused on what happens if a criminal is incarcerated. The median time served is 4 months if somebody is sent to jail. The median time served in the state prison system is 78 months for murder, 29 months for robbery, 38 months for rape, 16 months for aggravated assault, and 15 months for burglary and drug trafficking. This is hardly draconian under anybody's analysis or definition. In fact, I think it's important just to point out that we have approximately 250 million population in the United States today, and approximately 771,000 people total in state and federal prisons today, a little less than 1% of the total population. And during the 60s and 70s, while serious crime rose almost to 400%, prison capacity rose 27%. We had a moratorium on prison building during that time, and we are playing catch up and paying for that now. During our time here, we will be considering the government's role in the interaction of the individual and society, in the field of criminal law. Who is responsible when a person is raped or robbed or murdered? For most of the history of the common law, inquiry focused on the actor. In 20th century America, however, some have suggested that a wider net of responsibility be cast. In placing responsibility for crime, is it legitimate to look at the responsibility of the perpetrator's family, the educational system, the neighborhood, the environment, the victim, or the system itself? Some say yes. Others argue that to do so simply allows the actor to avoid responsibility, which is his alone. We will be considering these competing views this morning, I hope. Any meaningful discussion of personal responsibility in crime must necessarily examine today's criminal justice system. For example, the protection of the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendment rights. The exclusionary rule and Miranda become open to question or analysis. Should the criminal justice system focus on other issues besides the guilt or innocence of the actor? In the pursuit of other laudable goals, such as protection of constitutional rights, should physical evidence or confessions which clearly connect the defendant to the charged crimes be kept from jurors ruling on his guilt or innocence? Or are there other remedies which will safeguard constitutional guarantees but would not absolve everyone of responsibility? One of the major objectives of government should be the safety and the protection of the citizens, either through the military in the time of war or law enforcement in the time of peace. But has there been an insidious change in our national thinking? Have we put the burden on the innocent citizen to stay out of harm's way, rather than requiring, as any civilization must, that people don't break the law? Some believe we have shifted responsibility for crime from those who do it to those who suffer it. We do tend to blame the innocent victims of crime, and you've all heard it. You've seen defense attorneys in trial, and they turn to the victim at the height of their cross-examination and go, "Well, what were you doing out on that street at night, Mrs. Jones? Or why did you answer your doorbell when it rang? Or why did you drive on that street with your car doors unlocked in that part of town?" You know, one of the victims said so eloquently that blaming victims is like analyzing the cause of World War II and asking, well, what was Pearl Harbor doing in the middle of the Pacific anyway? Can it be argued that we have accepted a siege mentality in which we have no right to feel safe unless we are behind locked doors? We have laws to ensure some minimum level of behavior that is universally recognized as being essential for a civilized society. Laws are the reflection of the values of our society. And the seriousness with which we hold these values is measured by the penalty imposed when these values are violated. Therefore, how do we in the United States reflect our values for human life and welfare when threatened by rape and murder, robbery, burglary, or drug trafficking? How do we, as a civilized society, place responsibility for uncivil behavior? Who should be punished? For what reasons do we punish? What criteria should we look toward in devising appropriate penalties? Is rehabilitation still a viable goal, or is it habilitation now? What role does deterrence play, and is it feasible with our current sentencing standards? And should we as a society punish for the instructional value for the next generation? Some reformers today are saying that while criminals are in jail and prison, they are not victimizing innocent citizens on the streets in their homes, and therefore incapacitation should form the basis of our sentencing policy. We're going to look at some of these questions today with a very distinguished panel of experts that it is my pleasure to introduce. Few subjects are as important as this one, and I believe few impact our lives more. I'd like to start with Professor Grano. Professor Grano, to my left, is Distinguished Professor of Law at Wayne University, where he has taught since 1975. He holds an AB and JD from Temple University and LLM from the University of Illinois. He has been a reporter for the Michigan Supreme Court's Committee on Rules of Criminal Procedure since 1982 and has published essays on the Miranda versus Arizona decision and other criminal law procedures. He also was Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Department of Justice in 1988. Professor Norval Morris, to my immediate right, has been a professor of law and criminology at the University of Chicago since 1964 and was dean of the law school there from 1975 to 1978. He received his LLB and LLM from Melbourne University and his PhD in law and criminology from London University. He has served on numerous boards and also has written and edited some very famous books. One, The Crime and Justice, an annual review of research, highly respected, Norval, and has been published recently in the New York Times book review section and the University of Chicago Law Review. Now, I understand that you have some law students here, both former and current, both of you, that are going to hold you all accountable for your remarks today. We'll look forward to that. You line up at the podium after we have the introductions and the rebuttal. Mr. Adam Walinsky, at the end, has practiced with the New York firm of Kronish, Lieb, Weiner, and Hellman since 1971. He attended Cornell University and Yale Law School and clerked for the Second Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals after graduation. And by the way, there was not a Judge Carroll there, it was a Judge Hinks. Mr. Walinsky worked with Robert Kennedy at the U.S. Justice Department and the Senate 1963 to 1968. He ran as the Democratic candidate for New York State Attorney General in 1970. In 1978, he was appointed to the New York State Commission of Investigation and was its chairman from 1979 to 1981. Since 1982, Mr. Walinsky has worked to establish the Police Corps. This organization is trying to begin a program enabling citizens to serve 4-year terms as law enforcement officers in return for college scholarships. The forum here will be today that they will each speak approximately 12 minutes. One has agreed to waive some time to one other. We will see if that works out. To balance it out, they will then be given 5 minutes, no more rebuttal time, so we can open up to the questions of the floor. I will try not to intervene too often, except that I may be called on to level the playing field at some time. Thank you. Professor Grano.
Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. This is the second time I've been invited to speak at a lawyers' convention. In fact, the Federalist Society is the only place I find myself getting invited back to speak. Very suspicious. 2 weeks ago, I was listening on my car radio to a panel discussion on racial polarization in the city of Detroit, where I live. And not surprisingly, the discussion quickly turned to crime, and particularly to an incident that had occurred on July 4th of this year, which a bystander videotaped, in which a group of Detroit girls beat and robbed 2 suburban women who were attending a fireworks celebration in the downtown area. One of the panelists, an academic, and unfortunately from my law school, Wayne State University, said that she was not surprised that this incident had occurred. After all, the state had been cutting back programs, and it had failed to provide, quote, alternatives to occupy the time and interest of the young assailants. The only thing I found missing from this all too familiar academic critique was a blame to Reagan. Individual responsibility for this violent assault, clearly not in the worldview of this academic from Wayne State University. On February 18, 1990, 4 boys and 2 adult males, an adult in the sense that they were 19 and 20, them across the road to block the path of a 53-year-old suburban man who was driving through Detroit on his way home to the suburbs. Seeing what was happening, he attempted to speed away, and not inclined to let this occur, 16-year-old Kermit Haynes, who said the group wanted the car for the important purpose of going to a party, fired his gun and killed the fleeing driver. Haynes, who had a prior record, confessed to the crime, and shortly thereafter he pleaded guilty on the nose to first-degree murder, which is in Michigan. Under state law, however, 16-year-old offenders must be sentenced as juveniles unless the prosecutor persuades a judge that they should be treated as adults. The prosecutor tried to do this. He presented a psychologist's testimony that described Haynes as sadistic, amoral, dangerous, and a person with all the signs of a psychopath. A second psychologist reported that she had not found any indication that Haynes could be rehabilitated. On August 28th, just a couple of weeks ago, Dalton Roberson, who is the distinguished chief judge of the Detroit Recorder's Court, declined to sentence Haynes as an adult, which would have meant under Michigan sentencing law, since we don't have the death penalty, automatic life imprisonment without parole. Criticizing the prosecutor for not presenting an objective account of Haynes', quote, rehabilitative potential, Judge Roberson placed Haynes, who is now 18 years old, into the custody of the Department of Social Services, where he will remain until the ripe old age of 21. Individual responsibility for this senseless taking of human life, clearly not in the worldview of Judge Roberson. Mere anecdotes, to be sure. And I guess if I wanted to be counted as a serious scholar, I would cite statistical studies like were cited yesterday in the panel presentations. But I think to the ordinary citizen, these anecdotes are frighteningly illustrative of a legal system that has ceased to work, and of a legal system that too rarely holds individuals responsible and accountable for the evil they perpetrate. And I use the word evil deliberately. It's a word I think we should reintroduce into our lexicon. Unfortunately, the street-smart hoodlums of our society see this as clearly as do the ordinary citizens. And while many lawyers and judges sanctimoniously defend our criminal injustice system as essential to freedom, to preserve individual freedom, and while the academics search for anything and anyone to blame except the individual offender, and while the academics applaud approaches that give offenders second, third, fourth, and even more chances, the law-abiding citizens in our country are deserting our cities. In Detroit, for example, it's been reported this July 4th incident involving the young girls. And since the recent rash of carjackings, which has made national news, putting Detroit on the national map again, the retail business and restaurant business in the downtown area has been cut 50%. City slowly dies as all these apologies occur. Now, what accounts for the persistence of the world view that is illustrated by our misguided academic and by this misguided judge? To a large extent, the attitude that there, but for the grace of God, go I, which is always expressed in empathy for some reason with the offender rather than with the victim, has its roots, I believe, in the civil rights movement of the 1960s and in the conventional liberal ideology of the time that saw, and that unfortunately still sees, the typical criminal defendant in one courtroom as the very same person who is bringing a civil rights lawsuit next door. Now, I don't want to be understood. I'm not criticizing the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Indeed, I would say that the deafening silence of too many conservatives of those days about the profoundly immoral system of Jim Crow accounts for the albatross that contemporary conservatives find on their back when they speak out, and appropriately so, against racial preference policies, the modern version of civil rights bills which perpetrate civil wrongs, and when they speak out against the liberal ideology that still permeates, despite 20 years of supposedly conservative revolution on the courts, the liberal ideology that still permeates the workings of the criminal justice system. So my argument is not with the civil rights movement of the 1960s, but it is with the distorted vision that saw the criminal offender not as a responsible human being, a responsible perpetrator of evil, but as an unfortunate victim of a racist or of an oppressive society. The view that blame for a crime lies with society rather than with the individual offender never has had much popular support. Even in the 1960s, it always was more popular among academics in the legal profession. And I think in terms of popular support, it even has less today as crime is running rampant in our cities. Moreover, the social determinists never have been able to surmount the fact that the substantive criminal law, in fact, is premised on a foundation of individual responsibility and of blame. The common law mens rea requirement is just illustrative of this. To be sure, arguments have been made in support of new deterministic offenses, drug addiction, brainwashing, battered wife syndrome, post-traumatic stress, and just plain old rotten social background have been academic favorites for defenses. But the fact remains that the substantive criminal law is premised on the validity of individual responsibility and blame. The procedural system, however, has offered an attractive end run around the substantive criminal law for those who are determined to denigrate the importance of individual responsibility. The primary target, the principal target, has been the notion, the fundamental notion, that the goal of sound procedure, the paramount goal of sound procedure, should be the ascertainment of truth. Individual responsibility and accountability, of course, is not easy to achieve in a system that denigrates the importance of truth discovery as a goal. The academics were there to provide the underlying theory to justify the denigration of truth. Then they, with the lawyers and judges, provided the truth-defeating procedural rules, and they did so in abundance. And I'm not going to get into the rules. You're familiar with them, from the exclusionary rule to Miranda, Messiah, the no comment on silence rule, the Wade rule, the effort to get the minority view on entrapment where guilt and innocence would be irrelevant to the defense and things like that. And today we're witnessing the battle, of course, on habeas corpus reform, where the all too wrong of late American Bar Association is spearheading the drive to defeat the Bush administration's badly needed reforms on habeas corpus. To facilitate the denigration of truth discovery, the academics attacked the very concept of truth. And that's what I want to spend my remaining moments discussing, rather than issues like the exclusionary rule as such. We have been told, for example, that any emphasis on, quote, truth must be simplistic, given, and I quote just one of them, this is a typical quote like many of the others, given the plural forms and multifaceted aspects of that beguiling concept. I've often wondered what my mother's reaction would have been when she asked me if I locked my sister in the basement, which I was wont to do as a kid. If I would have said, well, the truth is a multifaceted and beguiling. This attack on truth has followed two different forms, two different tracks. The first maintains that fact-finding itself is just an uncertain process because of its dependency upon the perceptions, the inferences, and the memory, not to mention just the veracity of fallible human witnesses. In Professor Gary Goodpaster's words, the relationship between judicial truth and real truth, whatever that might be, is indeterminable. The second argument, which is hinted at in the parenthetical in that quote from Good Pastor, more broadly maintains that the very concept of truth has little meaning in legal proceedings. This argument contends that factual guilt and legal guilt are two different concepts, because the concept legal guilt requires an evaluation of intent and moral blameworthiness. Now, I don't want to spend time, because I don't have the time to spend, on the epistemological question of how can we know truth, other than to note that most of the commentators who denigrate truth discovery seem to have no trouble learning what occurred when the police supposedly have violated the judicially created rules that obstruct law enforcement. Nor might I add, do these commentators have any trouble with the notion of individual responsibility when it comes to police officers. What I want to focus on is the frontal attack on truth as a concept in the legal system. Professor H. Richard Uviller of Columbia University Law School offers this example to illustrate both that factual and legal guilt are different concepts, and that truth is not an appropriate concept to apply to verdicts in many criminal cases. He says, he gives this hypothetical: did the victim, moments before the defendant shot him, point a 6-inch blade at the defendant and say, "I'll kill you"? That would be scenario A. Or did he show a 2-inch knife? I don't know what the significance of the different size of the knife is, but did he show a 2-inch knife and say, "Don't come a step closer"? That is a simple issue of factual truth, he says, and it is quite different from the question, did the defendant act in self-defense? Surely. Surely? True enough, a homicide is justified by self-defense only when the perpetrator reasonably believes that killing is necessary to protect against imminent death or serious bodily injury. And I would have to concede in addition that evaluating the reasonableness of the defendant's fear cannot be equated with ascertaining who brandished what weapon or who said what to whom. Nevertheless, I would submit to you today that a normative judgment can be appropriately called incorrect if it rests on an incorrect factual assessment. Maybe I should say as an aside, first of all, that in the vast majority of criminal cases, I'm not sure there's such a normative judgment to make. I think that many of them turn on simple factual issues. But even when there is a normative judgment to make, as in the defense of self-defense, I think we can appropriately say that that verdict is correct or incorrect, depending on the correctness of the underlying factual assessment. Assume, for example, that the jury in Uviller's self-defense example would acquit the defendant on the first version of the facts, which has the victim coming at the defendant with a 6-inch knife saying, "I'll kill you." Assume the jury would acquit the defendant on that version of facts, but convict him on the second, where he's got the shorter knife and is saying, "Don't come any closer." While the abstract normative judgment may not be subject to evaluation by us in terms of its truth or falsity, it seems to me that the actual verdict can be correct in that case only if the jury got the underlying facts correct. Thus, if the jury mistakenly decides that the first factual version occurs, if it's wrong but decides that in fact the victim was coming at the person with the 6-inch knife attacking him, it will render an acquittal that I think we can properly say would be an erroneous and an unjust acquittal. Similarly, if it mistakenly decided that the second factual version was correct, it would render a conviction that I think we could call erroneous and unjust. What I'm suggesting is that even in the normative cases, the factual determinations, the objective truth of what occurred is all important to the verdict being correct and being just. I almost apologize for offering what I don't think is a profound statement. It's almost obvious in my view that that's the case. And yet if you look at the academic literature discussing the importance of truth in the criminal justice system, it would seem that this is subject to controversy. Well, we badly need, in my view, in our criminal justice system, indeed, I think if this symposium, this conference, as it has shown, we badly need in our whole society, to rediscover the importance of individual responsibility for evil acts. And just one step in this process of rediscovering that, it seems to me, would be the clear repudiation of arguments that deny either the existence of or just deny the importance of objective truth in the administration of criminal justice. Now, I'd talk to you about why this would actually matter in reducing crime, but I think I've already exceeded my time, so maybe I'll leave that for later. Thank you very much.
Professor Morris.
Thank you. The risk in time, if I speak impromptu, which I very much prefer to do, is, as my wife says, that I will wander away from the topic and then the even worse fault of returning to it. And I won't risk that. I am, I think, to be classified by Professor Grano as a misguided academic. But I will try to earn what little affection I can from you by brevity. It's customary, as you know, to open with expressions of gratitude for being invited to talk at a session like this. Well, by contrast, my dominant present sentiment is terror. I thought I might minimize the terror by wearing a London School of Economics tie, but it seems to be working the other way. The defense would be Hayek, not Lasky or Cripps. On the other hand, it's the same fear. I got fairly used to this fear, this terror, because it's rather similar that I used to feel in conversations at the University of Chicago with my law and economics people. Those Adam Smithian true believers who believe so differently from me and believe with a passion that puts an Iranian imam to shame. But over the years, I have come to learn to live with them. I lived with them even before several fled to the shelter of the newly revolutionary federal appellate judiciary. I came to understand, over time, it took me time, that they are too intelligent to believe that man's only motivation is greed. They clearly know better, yet they keep saying, so they must be teasing me, they must be dissimulating. And ever since I understood that they were dissimulating, that they couldn't believe anything quite that superficial, I've appreciated their clever contrivance, and my life at the law school has become very much easier, as some of you know. Well, I have a somewhat similar sentiment in relation to what I'm told is the heart of today's topic, personal responsibility in criminal law, and it was only exacerbated by Grano, I must say. I gathered that the central question was to be, in relation to underclass criminals, who is responsible, society or the criminal? On its face, and also on further reflection, that's a vacuous question. The compelling answer, obviously, is both. In different ways, both, but in very different ways. Is the criminals responsible, at fault, to blame, evil? Pick your epithet, Grano, I don't care. Choose your own epithet. Obviously it's so. Does anyone seriously doubt it? People seem to. It's about as vacuous as that question, do you favor the criminal or the victim? That's a silly question. Well, it is true that in this context, most members of the Federalist Society talk mainly about the personal responsibility of the criminal, and I heartily agree with them. They are totally correct. And it is also true that in this context, we card-carrying members of the ACLU talk mainly about the conditions in our inner city neighborhoods, which generate crime. And we are not in error either. Federalists and ACLUers are correct. They're interested in different things, but they're correct. So where is the argument? Well, Claggett, the master-at-arms in Billy Budd, you'll recall, got it right about himself. And I think Grano would be right to call Claggett evil. But he said, I am what I am and what the world has made me. Well, is there more to be said? Did Melville get it right? And that's it. I mean, is there more to it than that, if you're serious? Well, perhaps the difference of emphasis merits some brief embroidery. On his 87th birthday, in a magnificent lecture, which I commend to you, by Karl Popper, he entitled that lecture, A World of Propensities. He developed his propensity theory to explain the really remarkable tendency of statistical averages concerning human conduct to remain stable if the ambient social conditions remained stable. Social conditions create the propensities which generate crime. In a world of many evil people as well as many virtuous people, or like you and me, an odd mixture of the two. And while these propensities remain stable, crime will remain broadly stable. Hence it is that the incarceration rate for African American males in this country is nearly 8 times that for white males. 8 times per 100,000. Hence it is that the number one cause of death for African American males aged 15 to 34 is homicide. Hence it is that 1 in 4 African American males aged 20 to 29 is at this moment in jail, prison, or on probation or on parole. Hence it is that similar comparisons of infant mortality, birth weight, drug dependency, school failure, unemployment, and all the similar social indicators are equally skewed. That's not to deny evil, it's to state truth. It is important to note that as African Americans move into the middle class, they and their children's crime and delinquency rates are no different from the rest of us, and nor are the other social indicators. So the world of crime, like the world of other social breakdowns, is a world of propensities. And they are propensities every one of you well understands. Any one of you could visit one of our cities for the first time, be driven through it, talk to no one, be handed a map, and asked to sketch the high crime and delinquency areas. And you would do it about as well as the chief of police of that city. And you can test it. And I think you know that's true. You know the roots, the soil of crime. You know the social dislocations that over generations of despair and failure breed crime. There's no mystery at all about it. And I repeat, that is not to deny evil or human wickedness. Nor is it to deny that many people in those situations are not involved in crime or drug dependency. It is a world of propensities. And if you don't like it, then you're ostriches. And it is also wonderfully predictable. So it was last year, so it will be next year. And that fact in no way precludes the criminal's personal responsibility for the crime. In no way undermines Grano's horror stories or anecdotes. But one would have hoped it created an obligation on us, the privileged and protected, to try with sincerity over time to modify the criminogenic conditions that produce these formidable social dislocations. And this in genuinely offensive honesty, I must say. I rarely hear my friends of the Adam Smithian revolution talking about this necessity at all. They seem with composure to accept the increasing reality of the two Americas. For 25 years now, I have lived and worked with great contentment, and I've been privileged to do so, in a building on the borderland between the two Americas. Some of you will know it. And I watched the situation of one improve and the other become desperate. Our law school building is a handsome, comfortable, efficient building. I think as buildings go, it's the best law school building in the world. It's one of Saarinen last buildings. To the north is a privileged, educated, middle-class, racially integrated community with low crime rates. To the south, a destroyed, locked-in black underclass with astronomical crime rates and higher rates of incarceration than blacks in South Africa. These are not genetic differences. Of that you can be sure. Presumably, what over time society has created, society over time can change. if there be the will to do so. But I stress over time. Well, so much for societal responsibility. Let me come back to personal responsibility and earn what lingering drips of affection there may be there. Let me just note the propositions I would wish to defend, leaving their exegesis to the fortuities of our later discussion. Provided the lawbreaker was conscious of his illegal act and it was not a physiological reflex action, I would hold him responsible for it. This I've argued at book length. For this reason, I've argued at book length that there should be no special defense of insanity to a criminal charge. And much else follows logically from that proposition. For example, there should be no defense based on social adversity, if there be none for psychological adversity. So I totally accept personal responsibility. Grano's right. It's about the only thing he's right about. What relationship, then, should there be between social adversity and criminal responsibility? What is the relationship? What could we do? There would seem to me to be three possible responses to that question. First, the linkage can be ignored, which is our present situation. Second, the substantive criminal law might recognize social adversity as a mitigating defense, akin to provocation or extreme emotional disturbance, or an excusing condition like insanity. For my part, I don't think that a good idea at all, for reasons I lack time to. Third, the law and practice of sentencing might take express account of social adversity. I'm in doubt about this. This third posture has certain appeal to me, and it is certainly far removed from present popular or professional attitudes and astonishingly distant from the work of the United States Sentencing Commission. Well, in preparation for the ordeal of this panel a few weeks ago, I ran a 2-hour class for some 25 long-term prisoners in Stateville Prison. Stateville Prison is a sort of a paradigm prison with 2,100 prisoners in it, disproportionately black, serving very long terms. I've been a special master for Federal District Court there for 3 years in relation to prison conditions. And so I've come to know the place well. The session was billed as race and crime. 21 or 22 of the 25 prisoners were African Americans. You may be sure it was not a quiet meeting. It was much more tumultuous than the stunned silence I hear about me at the moment. I presented as precisely as I could the data on involvement in crime by race, arrests, prosecutions, convictions, sentences, including death sentences, all broken down by race, sex, and age. I'd done a lot of work on it, not for them, for another purpose. Their conclusion, vociferously expressed, was that we were discussing a situation of deliberate racial genocide. Only 3 or 4 agreed with me that it was not deliberate genocide, rather wicked neglect. They didn't deny their present personal responsibility. Let me give you a phrase or two they used to make the point that they do not, the more thoughtful, do not personal responsibility. One man said, "We injure our own families, not theirs," amongst a torrent of excuse. Another said, "It's our children, not theirs, who will be coming here," which I found a poignant sentence. Totally accepting personal responsibility. I think they saw the problem more clearly than those who preferred to pass by on the other side of the road. As a brief peroration, it was suggested I should talk of determinism and free will. Be comforted, I shall not. Just this. We live in a world of propensities in which one of the determinants is the reality of personal responsibility and the threat of punishment. It is clearly one of the determinants relevant to the propensities. How powerful it is, I am unsure. It clearly varies from one type of crime to another and from one personality to another. But it is there. An early member of the Federalist Society, Cardinal Newman, put it very well. As well, his phrase was excellent, as well tried to bind the rage, pride, and passion of man by threat of punishment as to try to guide the ship of state in a storm by strands of silk. As well try to bind the rage, pride, and passion of man by threat of punishment as try to guide the ship in a storm by strands of silk. well, Federalists keep talking about personal responsibility. I think you're right. Perfectly right. Grano is right about that. But for my part, I'm very much more interested in trying to do something over time, and it will take a long time, to reduce the brutally criminogenic effects of our destroyed inner city neighborhoods. Hence, as between my caricature, and I know it's a caricature, of the mainstream Federalist posture, and my caricature of the mainstream ACLU posture on this topic, I much prefer to focus my energies on the latter. You don't have to signal that I'm out of time anymore, Lois. Thank you.
Professor Walinsky.
I can't help but observing that there were more people here yesterday when the alternative was work than there are here today when the alternative was pleasure. Now, if that is a forecast of where we stand vis-a-vis the Japanese, I must tell you that it does not give me ease about our national future. Let me start by saying that Norval thankfully saved me a fair amount of the time that I might otherwise have had to spend. And to add to that part of what he said, only first a question. If you just stop and think for a minute about how the relevance of these discussions runs, think of the numbers that our moderator gave us. And when you understand, my numbers actually are that 47% of violent crime is reported.
That's what it used to be.
Well,
It's gone up. Better.
it's a little bit, but for example, clearance rates on many crimes have been going very sharply down. For example, the clearance rate on homicide, which never in the past was lower than 90%, is now down to 67% nationally. The clearance rates on robbery, which are the archetypal street crime, are now 25% nationally. So that if you realize that perhaps half of robberies are getting reported, and of those reported, 25% are being cleared by an arrest, and then figure that even of where you do get a conviction, and we get a reasonable number of convictions out of those arrests, 98% of the convictions are going to be by plea, so that the whole elaborate superstructure that lawyers erect of trials and decisions and then appellants and so on ends up being the most minute fraction of what is actually happening in the world. And you realize that while much of the discussion perhaps doesn't do active damage, it certainly is not likely to do a lot of good. And we would be much better off focusing, to start with, on the larger phenomenon. Now, it seems to me that a discussion of individual responsibility in the criminal law ought to start with an understanding that the criminal law is a misleading topic, a misleading word. The criminal law is in reality the fundamental social code. It's the social code at its most elemental. You may not hit your neighbor over the head and take his goods. And we must accept, if we stop to think for a moment, that this is an individual responsibility not only to refrain from malign action. We have to understand that the real question of individual responsibility, particularly in a room like this, is what is our individual responsibility to come to the aid of others? What is, because otherwise, if the question is not what is our individual responsibility, then we're just here talking about the fact that we're each isolate and alone. that we have no community, no commonwealth at all. Now, surely even lawyers whose ordinary professional lives are built on the proposition that we should advance the interests of a single client or agency at the expense of the entire, let justice, as we call it, rule till the heavens fall. Even we have to understand that that is not our fate. The conditions of the underclass of which Norval spoke, it seems to me have to be our focus, because this is the breeding ground of the violence that has spread so like a stain across every part of this country. Saul Bellow, 10 years ago, told us that children born outside the law and abandoned by their parents can be eaten by dogs or brought up without humanity. Nobody teaching the young language, human usages, or religion. They will go back to the great ancient forests and be like the wild beasts of Orpheus. None of the great compacts of the human race respected. Bestial venery, feral wanderings, incest, and the dead left unburied. Except, of course, that there are no longer any great forests to go back to. I tell you that that is not mere poetry, that is a description of life in which children are growing. Now, look, we are conservatives. I like to think that I was a conservative before you got to carry a card for being one. But if there is anything for which the conservative tradition stands, it seems to me, it is that the most important human responsibility is the teaching of the young. Because it is in the teaching of children that we establish the fundamental conservative proposition that there is a past which is important and that there will be a future to which we have a responsibility. Otherwise, we are merely animals lost in the desert of present time. And the question, it seems to me, for us then, is what are we going to do individually? What responsibility will we take to our fellow citizens, to children who otherwise will grow without the capacity for moral judgment? We can visit upon them as many pains and penalties as we wish. We can kill them in large numbers. We can imprison them in greater numbers. But we are growing more and more of these monsters every year. And is there evil? Of course. But we ought to ask ourselves, why is it that in our country we have so much more evil today than we did 20 years ago? Why is there so much more evil than there was 40 or 50 years ago? And we're the kinds of people who have to ask that question. Because if the people of education and the people who are equipped to think don't ask those questions, then no one will. And we will not answer them. Now, it seems to me that if we are to take individual responsibility, to act in the truly conservative sense for the criminal law, for the observation of the fundamental moral code. And it seems to me there are several ways in which that can be done. One way is, as participants in government, as so many of you are, after all, the Federalist Society, I don't know whether the founders never thought that it would start that way, but it ended up as one of the great intellectual job fairs of our time. So as participants, as so many of you are in the process of government, in the exercise of power in Washington, both those who are in it now, who were in it last year, who will be in it next year, You can use that position and that access, it seems to me, that platform, to attempt to call the government to its fundamental responsibility. I think it's all very well, and we understand, and you know, and when Professor Grano referred to the fact that somebody didn't blame President, or you know, usually people blame President Reagan or like to for almost everything that's wrong in the country. I agree that that's foolish, and we can laugh at it, but it would be a grave error, it seems to me, on all of our parts not to recognize that our government, and that means us for a long time, has been truly not responsible, has been truly irresponsible in allowing the continuation of these conditions, in failing to extend the fundamental protections of law and the Constitution to all of the people of the United States. So that's one thing that you can do, is not to let people forget, is to make of yourselves nuisances, burrs, whatever, and to force attention to these issues. Second, it seems to me, we can attempt to create institutions and mechanisms by which we can enable citizens to participate in the establishment and the protection of the law. One of the things, as you know, or as many of you know, is that some of us have been working. I have to say that pay particular tribute here to one of your founders, Peter Keisler, whose effort has been absolutely essential to establish a police corps that would engage citizens, just as we've had citizens always serving in the military, that would engage citizens for a period of their lives in the fulfillment of a civic duty to serve as police officers on an ROTC principle, and to accept, therefore, as part of the price of their education, the obligation to help directly in the personal enforcement of the law and the extension of safety and security and decency to people trying to raise their children. Third, for those who think that the government is too much with us, and I know that there is some here, I am sympathetic to that argument, who insist on voluntary principles, you know, there's always scope for individual action. In some ways, the absolute model, I would think, for individual responsibility in the criminal law are the guardian angels, and the people that we should have asked to be on the panel, maybe it should have been Curtis Sliwa standing here. This is not, now I know to some of you that's going to seem overdrawn. You're going to think, well, wait a minute, I mean, I'm a lawyer. Where does he start getting off talking about that kind of physical danger? Or much less the obligation to devote enormous efforts to the change of these conditions. But I want to put to you, I think, some reminders of what the responsibilities might be. Your generation, and by that I address the generation that founded and made this Federalist Society. This is, it seems to me, one that is uniquely favored in the history of this country. Almost alone in this century, you have been not called upon to fight in some foreign war. You are the first, indeed, to benefit from the collapse of the communist empire, something for which Americans before you have been working and sacrificing, and many of them dying, for 40 years. You are the inheritors of an unbelievable wealth of material richness and technology. So I would say that it has now come to be your turn to join in this kind of effort. Now you can say, and I have unfortunately heard things like this said, well, now wait a minute, how does this come to be my responsibility? Surely the responsibility for those children belongs to their parents. And if their parents are so neglectful that the leading cause of death, for example, for black children in this country between the ages of 1 and 4 is fire, think of that. leading cause of death is just kids burning up because somebody didn't attend to them. So we could say that. And you could say, well, how did this come to me? And the only rejoinder I have to you is that you know, you could go out to Arlington and look at all of those crosses. And none of those guys ever asked for that either. They just did their duty when they were called upon. So, look, I don't want to be overly difficult about this. I know I was privileged, on a personal note, I was privileged to be around when some of the early discussions of this society were, and its founding were created. And I know the impulses toward scholarship and public service that gave it birth. What I want to urge you to do is not to be caught in the easy simplicities or in too much of a carryover of the kinds of discussions that you had in law school. The time for those fights, I suggest to you, is over. The effort now is, how do we save a country in which the very structure of law and the whole moral basis for its existence is rapidly failing? And I mean, I know enough of you to know that I think that you will play your proper part in this effort over the years to come. Thank you very much.
A couple of comments. Professor Grano, for truth, should we abolish rules and then create a right without remedy? Are you going to talk about that a little bit, I hope, in your rebuttal? Professor Morris, you allude to the percentage incarcerated in South Africa, and it made me think of this kind of subtle inferences that I've heard from other panelists here today, in fact, some of the people. We accept a premise that we have more people in prisons in the United States than any other country in the world. I'm telling you, we don't know that. We have the most honest, open to scrutiny statistics in any other country in the world. Many other countries skew their statistics in such a way as we do not know what they have. Other countries have instant capital punishment and maiming. No, they do not have prisons. A great percentage of the countries have mental institutions where people go for life, but they don't call them prisons, but they don't get out. And other countries don't call things that we call crimes, crimes. For instance, child molestation, family violence, child abuse is not a crime in many other countries. And it just reminded me briefly when we were sitting here, I had an opportunity to meet with the Minister of Justice once in China, and he was telling me with great pride that we don't have any career criminals, we don't have any recidivists. And I thought, gee, well, that's really something. I mean, well, how's that? And of course, it was all to some bureaucratic system they had, and so I'm walking out, I asked the interpreter, I said, well, what is that? How do you? He said, Mrs. Herrington, we have 40 crimes subject to capital punishment. You wouldn't have any career criminals either if you did that. So, I think we have to look very carefully and not accept that as a premise, but I know Mr. Morris is madly writing here for rebuttal on that. And Professor Walinsky, we did in 1982 have 40% of victims reporting crime. We are now, blessed, treating our victims of crime better. They feel they can come forward and report, and we've moved to not the enormous number, but we have now moved to 55% have reported crime. All right, 3 minutes apiece. Professor Grano.
Well, I found it curious that Professor Morris, who says he believes in individual responsibility, if given a choice to focus on individual responsibility or the ACLU approach, which would focus on societal responsibility, chooses the latter. What message does that send, and what message does it send when the legal system makes that choice about individual responsibility? What really is the cause for a crime? And in fact, it was interesting the words that were used. He talked about conditions which generate crime, conditions which produce crime. Well, generate and produce are causal words. And I guess I would object to using those words. Conceitedly, there's a correlation We know, all of us know, as he said, where the high crime areas are. And they are in the low-income areas, the areas of our cities that are really deplorable. But that doesn't mean that they're the cause of crime. He also argued that crime will remain stable no matter what we do. Well, that's that argument that the whole system, the criminal justice system, is irrelevant to the crime problem, and we've been operating on that since the 1960s. Interesting, we were just told a minute ago, why is there more evil today? Why has it increased in the last 20 and 30 years? The fact is it has. When I was a kid, the bad neighborhoods of the city were not as bad as they are today. Why has it gotten worse? Could it be that it's the attitude that's been reflected in these comments? That we blame the society, we blame the conditions, rather than the individuals. As an academic, I have problems attacking academics because it seems like I'm attacking my own profession. But I have to say that you always hear from academics, don't go for simplistic solutions. It's more complex, more complicated than that. Well, my grandparents were immigrants, and all of them were, and they had simplistic approaches to life. And I think things worked better in those days. In fact, I've often been tempted to write a book, and don't anybody steal it from me, because when I stop writing these ridiculous law review articles, maybe I'll do it. The book would be Raising Children the Immigrant Way. Without the child psychologists and things like that, I think they did a pretty good job because they used common sense. And I'll tell you a story that ties in. It's an anecdote. It's not something that academics engage in, but it ties in with what William Bennett talked about last night. My father told me when I was a teenager and we were having trouble with one of our neighbors, we used to play half ball in the street. You know, that's a game where you cut a rubber ball in half and use a broomstick to hit it. We didn't play it and had close neighborhood playgrounds or anything like that. One of the neighbors was complaining, and my father was sort of picking up for the neighbor because we had been rude to the neighbor. And I was objecting that he always picked up for the neighbors and not for us. And he told the story of when he was a kid, a policeman had sort of grabbed him by the ear. I forget what exactly he was doing. And his mother came out and said, "What's the problem here?" And my father immediately chimed up before the policeman could speak. Well, this wise guy, and he never got any further because my grandmother slapped him across the mouth for speaking that way about a police officer. Now, that's an anecdote, but it's what Bill Bennett said. There used to be rules. There used to be things that were wrong, things you didn't do. I'm not saying that the authority figure is always right, but there were ways of behavior and ways that were understood, and you didn't have excuses. These were people who grew up in the Depression, et cetera. It seems to me that what Alan Keyes said yesterday in his remarks, although they were so eloquently delivered, I'm not trying to take away from what he said, but what he said was not really profound. It was moving and stirring because it's so foreign to our ears, but it was not really profound. In fact, my grandparents could have said what Alan Keyes said. The question is, why is it that the academics can't see that?
All right, thank you. Professor Morris.
I don't really believe in rehabilitation, so I'm going to leave Grano to my colleague on the right. Respond only very briefly to Lois Herrington's point. I was thinking of countries with which we would wish to compare ourselves. I'm happy to give you figures, and I have even money bets at any level you want. They're broadly correct. 2 weeks ago, a conference with directors of correctional systems from Western European countries, but in particular I have the exact figures as at the end of 1990 per 100,000 putting prison and jail together. For Sweden, 61, United Kingdom, 98, which is the highest in Western Europe. Canada, 107, United States, 426. And if you want a side bet, you're on.
I think indeed that we have many more people in prison than that. Because you would have to say, anyone who would visit, for example, the average housing project, whether in Professor Morris's city of Chicago or in my city of New York or many others around the country, would have to say that most of the decent people in those projects are themselves prisoners. We are all, in a sense, restricted in our liberty by the existence of the conditions about which we are speaking. And I am only disturbed, the only thing that disturbs me about what Professor Grano said is somehow the notion, that is, I fear implicit there, that what is required of us is that we strike the proper attitudes and applaud at the right time and say the right things in law schools, and that this somehow will make things be all right. I have to say that indeed I don't understand why he used the word low income, which is really only, after all, our current synonym for black when we don't want to say it, because we are so filled with shame and guilt and fear. We are so appalled by the horror of our racial division and what it has brought, that we want to speak of it with euphemism rather than confront it directly. And it seems to me that if you ask, as he did, obviously there are many reasons, but if you were to compare now to 20 or 30 or 50 years ago and ask why is there so much more evil, surely one of the things that has happened has been precisely our unwillingness to confront this. And that for 30 years indeed, and I mean many of you, listen, weren't even around at the time, so you can't be expected to know it, much less to feel yourselves responsible, but the fact is that you are citizens of a country, as are we all, that basically for 30 years has withdrawn the authority of government from the ghettos. The discussion of whether to hold people responsible is in some ways enormously academic because the government hardly exists in large parts of the United States. It's only an accident when one of these crimes, these repeated crimes, gets dealt with in any serious way. And it seems to me that if we are to change that, if we are to begin to reestablish order, decency, law, the very simple fundamentals of law enforcement and civilized conduct, that's going to require an enormous effort. That's going to require a great commitment on the part of each of us. That's going to require much more than simply thinking the right thoughts. That's going to take work.
Now, are there some questions from the floor? I hope there are. All right, if they'll just stand right up at the mic and let's go as quickly as we can. Actually, this gentleman here, yes.
Yes, Roger Pilon, Cato Institute. At the risk of saying something that may be unfashionable in this society, but something that such friends of the society as Milton Friedman and Bill Buckley and others have said, I'm struck by the fact that the discussion of individual responsibility and the criminal law this morning has not raised the issue of the war on drugs and its implications for crime in America today. The points that Professor Morris has raised, I think, are very well taken, namely about the propensities that Popper talked about and the social conditions that contribute to, not cause, but contribute to crime. And it strikes me that one of those social conditions is the war on drugs and the perverse incentives that have been created by that war. The war on drugs is really about money in the end. It's not about drugs. The money and the incentives that surround drugs has driven our crime rate sky high, has clogged our courts beyond description, has overcrowded our prisons such that real criminals are now back out on the streets much sooner than they should be.
All right, now I found a new thing. I'm going to have to limit the questioners.
Okay.
All
In
right.
a nutshell, if we are serious about individual responsibility, then let people take responsibility for their own drug use and let the rest of us be free. Would you like to comment?
Professor Morris, you want to go first?
Of course I do, and I want an hour, but I'll try to do it in a second or two.
Your body language tells us that. We can tell.
The point about serious offenders being released by virtue of the crowding of the prisons is a very important one. All of these discussions have become political footballs. Politically, neither Democrats nor Republicans seem to me to take crime seriously. They simply use it for vote getting. And that, I think, is the essential problem. And this is at its highest peak in relation to drugs. Headings only. What do we really care about? I care about children's exposure to drugs, the destruction of neighborhoods, and the involvement of of drugs in certain type of repetitive crimes, and drugs in relation to certain professions. For the rest, I do not think the government has anything to offer. But in relation to those, I think we have a lot to offer. I think that's what most people care about, but we never focus on what we care about. We mouth platitudes about personal choice and causation, and it's political suicide to talk sense about drugs in America.
You can certainly say we never focus if you look at about 3% of the dollar is spent on criminal justice and the rest is spent on other things in the United States. You had a comment on this?
Well, I think that it's certainly true that the drug sweeps and the large-scale drug enforcement have acted as a very destructive and disorganizing element, both to the enforcement of the criminal law. It's been very distracting. Basically, our police have been acting as the Army did in Vietnam, conducting search and destroy missions, but they never stay to guard the hamlets. That's one of the things that has to change. So far as the debate about drugs in the country, I think the professor is right. It is everybody's evasion. I think a lot of, for a lot of blacks, it's been the latest incarnation of the white devil theory. Ronald Reagan is to blame because he lets these evil people bring the drugs in for our condition. For a lot of conservatives, unfortunately, or certainly for a couple of administrations, drugs were a way of avoiding any serious comment or effort to cope with the social conditions. We could just send an aircraft carrier maybe to off Columbia or send some Green Berets down there, and that was our contribution to dealing with the chaos of the inner city. I don't know that legalization, which I take it was the point of your comment, would make anything that much better. But if you're asking, has all of the talk and attention on the drug menace really been an enormous distraction from reality? I think the answer is yes.
Professor Grano, did you have something to add to this?
Let's go to the next question.
All right, I just want to comment briefly on just one aspect of it. In 1986, the most recent statistics we had for drug traffickers, just if we're going to look at the values that we hold once they're in the criminal justice system, what happened to the drug traffickers in state courts? 1/3 of convicted drug traffickers got straight probation. 1/3 of the drug traffickers were sent to jail, and another third were sent to prison, and then we know what the length of the sentences are. So I think that's just important to keep in the context of where we are. You had another question?
Yeah, my name is Randy Bryant. I've often read that one of the reasons we have such a high percentage of our people in prison is because we have such long prison sentences, and that as a deterrent, the sociologists, I guess they are, believe that it's much more significant for deterrence the swiftness and certainty of conviction and imprisonment rather than the length of the sentence that counts. But we don't seem to pay attention to that. We have things now like the federal sentencing guidelines and life sentence without parole, instead of changing what everyone says that apparently seems to know is the problem. Aside from legislating away the exclusionary rule, which I wouldn't agree with personally, I'd like the panelists to comment on that and see if they agree with it and if there's something that can be done.
Professor Morris, you want to start there?
Very briefly, length of sentences here are crime for crime much longer than other Western European countries. I don't think that anyone can speak with great confidence about deterrent processes in this area. All that I think it's fair to say is that we've never been able to find a useful correlation between prison populations and crime rates. either in time or between countries. That doesn't mean that prisons are not necessary, but Cardinal Newman, they are strands of silk.
Mr. Walinsky, did you have something you wanted to say?
No, you're quite correct that, we've basically doubled the prison population in the United States over the last 10 years, mostly by lengthening sentences rather than really by imprisoning larger numbers of people. And it is, we have, to the extent that we're just warehousing people who otherwise would be out committing more crimes, and to some extent that's true, it's helpful. But if you're asking, is it operating as any kind of deterrent, I think the answer is no. The truth is that that there is a large subculture, like it or not. We now have a very substantial subculture in which going to prison is not feared. It's a perfectly reasonable part and an expected part, come to be an expected part of a young man's life. And the time spent in prison, whether it's 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, is passed relatively easily. There are clean cells, which may indeed be cleaner than what's at home. There's regular meals. As somebody who has investigated prisons with the New York State Commission of Investigation, I can assure you that not only do prisoners get regular exercise, they get regular sex, and regular access to drugs, which are as easily obtainable in prison or even more easily obtainable than they are on the street. So it seems to me that the whole notion of what we're, if people think that what we're doing is using these really as some grand deterrent measure so far as the underclass is concerned, I think that that's a delusion.
Professor Grano, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I think the statistics we were given on crimes and sentences indicate that our sentences are not too long. You have to factor into the length of American sentences that you have to commit about 5 crimes before you get sentenced to prison. So if you look at the sentence for a particular crime, that approach, it wouldn't be so great at all. Secondly, on the deterrent purpose, this again is this effort to make the criminal justice system insignificant. In that anecdote I gave you about the young boys and the 2 so-called adults, the 19 and 20-year-old who shot to death that driver, it's no accident, no coincidence that the shooting was done by the juvenile rather than the adult. Ask any prosecutor in our city in Detroit, and I think this would be true in other cities too, and they'll tell you that the shooter always winds up being the young guy. They're not afraid of prison. They don't. They want to go to prison. Why do they have the juvenile commit the murder? Because the juvenile is not going to go to prison for any length of time. They know it. The law affects behavior. This is a myth that's been perpetrated for 30 years that the system doesn't have a deterrent effect. The way we run it, it may not have a deterrent effect, but we can make it so that it would have a deterrent effect.
I'd just like to comment to be very cautious that you look not at what the sentences that are sentenced, but what the time that people did serve is. I think that's a very big indicator. And also, we do have some strong indication that the increase is new people going to prison, not longer sentences. That's really, really well documented. And the newest Uniform Crime Reports figures do come out and show a direct correlation between the crime and the prison population and the reduction. It is absolutely in sync. The only problem is our population is growing enormously, and we can't forget that. Okay?
My name is Keith Krasnov. I was a prosecutor in New York for 4 years in narcotics, and I've been a defense attorney in Florida for 14 years. And I have a comment and a question. First of all, if one looks at all of the criminal dockets, both a misdemeanor and felony in almost all of the cities in the states in the United States, you'll see that almost 3/4 of the crimes are alcohol or drug related. In misdemeanors, it's driving under the influence of alcohol. In felonies, it's either possession of cocaine or burglaries or strong arm robberies or something of that sort done with drugs. I don't know how many of my clients have come to me, parents, and try to get their kids into drug rehabilitation programs, only to be turned away because it costs about $3,000 a month and you need really good insurance to get into one. And my question is this: since we have forfeiture laws on the books, which are getting hundreds of millions of dollars in each year into the federal government for property rightly forfeited from from criminals, shouldn't we have a situation where the government we could pass a law added to the forfeiture statutes directly saying that 50% of the money raised would go back to the states and would be allocated if the states were to have a program of commitment by demand by parents, so that a parent would be able to get their kid into a drug rehabilitation program. And in that way, we would perhaps make some kind of a dent in the rising drug population, which is clogging our dockets and costing us a lot of money.
I think that's a good comment, and I'm going to go to the next question because they've asked us to close right around 12:30 so they can set up and get there for lunch. So I'm going to take this.
If anyone gives me any other question, I'll comment on yours.
I'm sorry, Norval. Yes.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity. Some things I think. I'm a psychiatrist from New York, and I think that some of your responses might have to run into a time after this session. But
55 minutes after, right?
True that this is an angrier country with more of a propensity for criminality than, say, 40 years ago, before the civil rights movement and the perpetrator rights movement. We didn't face the situation of our cities being held hostage. And I think we need to think about whether our zeal for balancing opportunity and responsibility as a means of correcting societal roots to criminality contributed to the generation of anger. Has the rapidly increasing influence of things like TV and movies on an uneducated population, educated by what they are seeing, introduced the reality of the polarization of our communities and the decline of the family that you speak of, and community resources, and vigorous enforcement of police structure in these bubbling cauldrons enabled the expression of anger to continue?
I'm going to stop you here because there's two others and we do have, but I'm going to thank you for coming because we need psychiatrists and we need psychologists and we need your input and we need you to be here. I'm going to move to two more because we really have a time constraint.
Quick sentence. I think that we need to consider, if you'll allow me, Freud's identification with the aggressor principle.
Ooh, Freud.
Because I think that a lot of this operates, and I think that if we do substantive things like consider social opportunity and continued structure rather than superficial pandering, such as terms like African American.
All right, I'm going to cut you off now, and even the woman might, if you mention Freud too much in the women's presence here. All right.
Thank you.
Make this real quick, okay?
Yeah, I was struck by Professor Morris's reference to, I think the phrase was social dislocations in the inner city causing crime. It seems as if the major social dislocation in the inner city is crime, and the inability of government to deliver on the prerequisites of civilization, the most fundamental basis of the social contract. It seems that is the fundamental dislocation, not the other way around.
I think, let me respond to that if I may. I don't think that I would disagree with you in the slightest. In fact, I would quote to you, say, from Congressman John Lewis, who recently said that it is not now poverty that is causing crime, it's crime that's causing poverty. I think that and it is precisely for that reason, it seems to me, that I think that we have to recognize that we have not enforced the law. We have not extended its protections. We have allowed violence to run absolutely unchecked through these communities for 30 years. We are now reaping the results of that failure. Your statement about about violence and crime as a generating cause is absolutely correct. My only question is, now what are we going to do about it?
All right, I'm going to have to cut.
All
right, go on, Norval. I know you're just bursting.
I didn't use the word cause. The causation of social behavior is really, even if Grano doesn't believe it, not a commonsensical question. It's quite difficult. I tried to use more technical propensities, pressures, of which personal responsibility is one. But in a sense, crime, infant mortality, low birth weight, drug dependency, unemployment are all one single problem. They interrelate. The causal relationships, if they exist, go both ways. You're clearly correct. But isn't this character right? The problem is, given those truths, what do we do?
Well, I know that you're very pleased with the panel. They have promised that they will not eat lunch, and they will stay up here and answer. No, I'm just kidding. They will answer all the questions. Thank you for coming.